Okay, let's just dive right into this. We're looking at an incredibly bizarre medical mystery today. It's about a 25-year-old guy who was undeniably heavily intoxicated, yet entirely sober. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most astonishing biological phenomena on record. This is a case that completely threw doctors for a loop and literally forced them to rethink everything they thought they knew about human digestion.
I mean, picture this. You're standing in an emergency room. You're slurring your speech, you're stumbling around, and you're desperately trying to convince these incredibly skeptical doctors that you haven't touched a single drop of alcohol. They're looking at you, they're noting your unsteadiness, and literally every visual cue is screaming, "This guy is drunk." But you just keep repeating over and over, "I haven't had any alcohol."
And then the blood test comes back. The doctors find a staggering blood alcohol concentration of 0.3. Now, to put that into perspective for you, that isn't just a little buzzed. That is a massive, incredibly high level of intoxication. So naturally, looking at these numbers, the doctors came to the obvious conclusion, right? He's just lying. They completely assumed he'd been on a massive bender before showing up and was just trying to cover his tracks.
Well, they eventually send him home. But here is where the story gets really strange. The mysterious episodes of intoxication, they didn't stop. They kept happening. This was a guy with zero history of major medical problems and absolutely no history of alcohol abuse. Yet completely out of nowhere, his thinking would suddenly get cloudy, his speech would blur, and his coordination would just go out the window.
So everyone is thinking the exact same thing. Is he secretly drinking? Every single piece of medical evidence and all of his behavior pointed straight to heavy drinking. It got to the point where even his own family began to seriously doubt him. Because, let's be honest, "I'm not drinking" is exactly the kind of thing someone who's had way too much to drink might say. The doubt got so overwhelming that his wife actually took matters into her own hands and bought a breathalyzer to test him at home.
She basically set up an at-home science experiment, using herself as the control subject, and the results were wild. Even when he had no obvious symptoms, his resting level was registering between 0.04 and 0.07%. And during a full-blown episode, he shot all the way up to 0.2%. Meanwhile, his wife is taking the exact same tests under the exact same conditions and blowing a flat zero. This was the proof. He was registering alcohol on his breath, even when she was sitting right there, watching him eat, knowing for a total fact that he wasn't sneaking off to drink.
So thanks to his wife stepping in, it was proven he wasn't pouring himself a drink. And just like that, the whole investigation shifted. This went from a suspected behavioral issue to what seemed like a biological impossibility. The evidence was right there on the breathalyzer, over and over again. So if he wasn't drinking it, where on earth was the alcohol actually coming from?
The doctors aggressively hunted for some kind of common explanation. I mean, they ran this poor guy through a gauntlet of medical tests. They checked for celiac disease, ran stool studies, looked for thyroid abnormalities, checked his blood sugar, you name it, they tested for it. But every single one of these tests came back totally normal. It was just this incredibly frustrating series of medical dead ends, all while the severe intoxication episodes just kept happening. Eventually, the medical team had to start considering an explanation that honestly sounds a bit ridiculous at first. The alcohol wasn't coming from a bottle at all. It was actually being brewed right there, inside his own body. This is known as auto-brewery syndrome, or sometimes gut fermentation syndrome. It's an extraordinarily rare condition where actual intoxicating quantities of ethanol are produced entirely inside the patient's own digestive system. Now, to really grasp how this works, we need to look at traditional fermentation out in the real world. Grapes ferment into wine, grains ferment into beer, and sugar converts to alcohol. It's just a fundamental biochemical process. In a normal brewery, yeast, which is a tiny single-celled fungus, gets introduced to a sugary liquid in an environment with no oxygen. The yeast essentially eats those sugars for energy, and as a byproduct, it spits out carbon dioxide and ethanol. And that ethanol, that's the exact same alcohol that gets you drunk.
And that brings us to the absolute core focus of our explainer today, why the human body itself can suddenly start fermenting food. It starts when the patient simply eats totally normal carbohydrates. We're talking bread, a bowl of pasta, maybe a soda. But instead of the body digesting them the normal way, microorganisms living inside the dark, warm, zero-oxygen environment of the gut just completely hijack the process. They ferment those carbs exactly like yeast in a giant vat of beer. And the resulting ethanol doesn't just sit there in the stomach. It gets absorbed directly through the intestinal walls and goes straight into the bloodstream. So the patient eats a completely innocent everyday meal, and his own internal microbes act like a tiny, unauthorized brewery.
So you might be sitting there wondering, how does this actually happen? Why aren't all of us walking around completely smashed after eating a big bowl of pasta? I mean, we all have microorganisms in our guts, right? Well, the answer to that lies in a literal microscopic turf war and the incredibly delicate, unseen balance of our body's internal microbiome.
See, a normal microbiome is packed with trillions of microorganisms. It's mostly harmless bacteria, along with a tiny amount of fungi, and they're all constantly competing for space and nutrients. In a healthy gut, the bacteria win the race. They grab those carbohydrates and break them down into completely harmless byproducts. But in an autobrewery microbiome, that delicate balance is totally shattered. Specific types of yeast, like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is quite literally brewer's yeast, are somehow allowed to multiply way out of control. When they outnumber the good bacteria, they get first dibs on the carbs you eat. They effectively take over the gastrointestinal tract and just turn the whole thing into a fermentation factory. So what actually sets off this internal brewery? Well, a lot of the time, the catalyst is something as incredibly common as a routine course of antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are fantastic at killing bacteria to cure an infection, but they're blind. They don't discriminate. They wipe out the normal, good bacteria in your gut right along with the bad stuff. But here's the kicker. Yeast is a fungus. That means it is entirely immune to antibiotics. So with all its bacterial competition suddenly wiped out, the surviving yeast is left with a wide open playing field. It spreads like wildfire, gorging on every carbohydrate you eat and flooding your bloodstream with pure ethanol. Thankfully, for our 25-year-old guy, this terrifying medical mystery was finally solved. His doctor successfully treated him with fluconazole, which is a specific antifungal medication. It essentially targeted and killed off that overgrown yeast, acting like a reset button for his gut flora so the normal bacteria could finally repopulate. And it worked. After the treatment, he was able to go right back to his normal carb-heavy diet, and he didn't have a single returning symptom. But before we wrap up the science side of things, we really have to just acknowledge the absolute terror of this condition. Just think about the sheer social nightmare here. You're slurring your words, you smell like a bar, you're failing police breathalyzers. You look entirely guilty. You can be completely innocent, telling the absolute 100% truth, yet literally every single piece of evidence makes you look like a massive liar. It is truly frightening to be accused of something you genuinely didn't do, especially when your own body is the thing betraying you. This summary quote really just shatters all our initial assumptions about what was going down in that emergency room. The alcohol was real, the intoxication was real, the blood test was real. The only thing missing was the drink. This case proved absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt that he wasn't lying, he wasn't sneaking drinks in the bathroom, and he certainly wasn't just imagining these symptoms. And I think this brings us to a much broader takeaway for this explainer. Your body isn't just some simple machine with basic inputs and outputs. It's an incredibly complex, living ecosystem. Bizarre syndromes like this force us to rethink our biology entirely, because as it turns out, you don't actually need a bottle, a glass, or a factory brewery to get drunk. Under the exact right, or I guess wrong circumstances, your own internal ecosystem can literally become one. So, I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. The next time someone stumbles up to you and says, "I swear, I haven't had anything to drink," are you going to believe them? We always assume we know exactly what that means. But as we've explored today, sometimes the human body pulls off the impossible, and the biological truth is way, way stranger than a lie.